Thank you and welcome. My name is Jafari Sinclair Allen. It's amazing that I went down to my paper to read my name. My name is Jafari Sinclair Allen, and I'm the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies at the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of my beloved colleagues and students to this occasion in this wonderful space in our beloved village of Harlem. In the 3 decades since its founding, IRAAS, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, has positioned Columbia faculty as leading interpreters of the urban Black experience in neighboring Harlem and beyond, with a multidisciplinary faculty representing numerous diverse scholarly specialties and themes. The department, established in 2018, builds upon this distinctive vision of African diaspora studies, New York-based urbanism, and Black social cultural thought. Still, our foundation reaches back much further, including, for example, to pioneering anthropologist and writer ZORA Neale Hurston, whose literary and ethnographic work is a touchstone for study and reflection of Black diaspora. And before I introduce our esteemed speaker for the evening, I just want to say a bit about Zora Neale Hurston and the connections between Ms. Zora and those of us in the social sciences like Mignon R and myself who try in various ways to follow in this intellectual tradition. Foundational anthropologist of Black diaspora and writer Zora Neale Hurston started her career as a doctoral student in anthropology at Columbia University. Those from Barnard will say before that, Barnard, of course, right, at Barnard College and Columbia University. Her skills as an ethnographer during the Harlem Renaissance attended to people and cultures in ways that capture the rich daily experiences of Black life in the South and in the Caribbean. Her literary contributions have transformed the landscape of American literature. With her rich body of essays, books, plays, and stories, she remains a pillar within global Black studies. Hurston's prose sculpted the contours of the everyday lives of Black peoples, as as our colleague Mabel Wilson has said before. We can witness this in her essay "Bits of Harlem." She writes, "The hurly-burly of Lenox Avenue fretted your soul. The dirty corpses of yesterday's newspapers flapping upon the pavement or lying supine in the gutter, together with the host of the unwashed and washed but glaringly painted, was too unlovely, and we fled up 181st Street. We were not really hungry, but we longed for rest." This is to say that Zora's work is timeless. Mignon R is the Anne Whitney Olin Professor of Sociology at Barnard College, Columbia University, and a beloved affiliate of AAADS and IRAAS. The former vice president of the Association of the American Sociological Association. She is a sociologist of race, gender, sexuality, and aging who teaches courses on the sociology of family and qualitative methods. Although her work spans various age cohorts, socioeconomic categories, social environments, and methodological frameworks, it is united in its purpose to challenge assumptions and paradigms drawn from the experiences of dominant racial and socioeconomic groups. These, she says, cannot explain processes and outcomes for people who occupy other structural positions in society. She analyzes race, gender, class, and sexuality not just as identity statuses, but as structural locations that influence individual life chances and the ways individuals experience their social worlds. Professor Moore's first book, Invisible Families, Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Among Black Women, examines the intersection of race with sexual orientation for family building and lesbian identity among African American women. Tonight, we will be privileged to hear work from her new book entitled Shadow of Sexuality, In the Shadow of Sexuality, Social Histories and the Development of Community Among Black Sexual Minority Women, 1950 to 1979. Her lecture tonight is To Find the Life That I Want, Black Sexual Minority Women in the Mid-20th Century Struggle for Sexual Autonomy and Economic Freedom. That is to say, again, that this work is timely and perhaps timeless. And so I want everyone to welcome warmly someone who did not need the introduction that I gave, but we did it nonetheless, our friend and our colleague and sister, Mignon R.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm happy to be with you all tonight. I want you to get up and get some more food while I'm talking. Don't worry, get something to drink. Okay, don't feel that you have to sit there. If you want to get up, it's fine. If you want to just stand, it's a beautiful space. So I just want to say that. You can walk around. This year at Barnard College, we are celebrating the ZORA NEALE HURSTON Centennial and 100 years of Black students at Barnard. And in light of these activities and in celebration of Women's History Month, I'm happy to be here. And I'll also share that I am part of Columbia College class of 1992. And when my fellow alumni and I learned that I would be giving this address here at the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Educational Center, they were thrilled because this is the site of the Audubon. And when we were students, the university wanted to tear down the Audubon to create new academic buildings, but the BSO and other students fought for the establishment of this center, and we had these black armbands, and we had protests, and so it is just really exciting to be here in this way. So the title of my remarks, To Find the Life I Want to Live. To find the life I want to live. It's particularly meaningful for several reasons, which I hope will become clear as I talk with you a little this evening. So I'm finishing, and it feels like I'm forever finishing, a book on the social histories of older Black lesbian women. And I focus on the period they came into adulthood. And in this photo is Jewel Thayas Williams, owner of the Catch One nightclub in Los Angeles, with DJ Lovey. And DJ Lovey, yes, there she was DJing that night. So I focus on the period when these people came into adulthood, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I want to learn more about how they understood themselves in the mid-20th century and the conditions that caused them to come together in the 1970s to consider sexual orientation not just as a set of attractions, but as something around which to cohere as a group. And as my colleague Jafari mentioned, the title of this project right now is In the Shadow of Sexuality, Social Histories and the Development of Community Among Black Sexual Minority Women, 1950 to 1979. And one of my goals is to analyze, from a sociological perspective, a group of women who stand at the juncture of African American and LGBTQ history. Their lives are intertwined with the Second Great Migration. They entered adulthood during several important and interrelated social movements of the time. They had to adapt to restricted labor markets that offered an uncertain ability for women to make ends meet and be autonomous. And they were part of a larger social world that interpreted their intimate relationships as deviant and illegal. So they constantly grappled with how to understand their lives, wondering whether, how they could fit into society. Many did not last. They did not last. They were not able to live their lives as lesbian or bisexual women because the oppression and sacrifice, they were too great. And I am locating and telling the stories of those who were able to maintain over multiple generations a sexual minority identity that is simultaneous with a racial identity. So I'm going to use the lens of migration to frame their diverse experiences. And I'm going to begin with the question, why did Black lesbians migrate to northern and western cities? And how do their experiences fit into the larger migration narratives for African Americans and for white LGBTQ people who were also migrating to cities during this era? And I want to know how their geographic movement influences the communities that they found themselves in. What did they need to embrace their sexuality as an identity? What were the costs and the sacrifices of those decisions? So here are some migration stories. Barbara Jean Abrams. Growing up in Jacksonville, Florida, Barbara Abrams, born in 1944, went by Bobby Jean. And when members of her family called out to her, they pronounced her name with a hum in their throat. So the sound had kind of a whine to it. She lived on a hog farm, and there was always hard work that needed to get done. As the only daughter in a family of 3 children, Bobby Jean was responsible for all of the quote-unquote girls' jobs. So she had to cook, wash dishes, and constantly clean the house. About 3 or 4 times a week, she would scrub the wood floors with lye, which they called pot ash. Life in Florida during this time was difficult. Her family struggled to get by, though no one went hungry. Someone worked at the hospital, so they slept on sheets and pillowcases that said Duval County Hospital right down the middle. But the 3 siblings shared one bed, and they rationed toilet paper by first using brown paper bags that they would rub together until they became softer, and only when it was really needed were they given toilet paper on the roll. Now, 1969, when Barbara Jean was 24, she left Jacksonville and arrived in New York on her own, having dropped Jean from her name. She bought 5 outfits in her little yellow trunk, along with $600 in cash. And a cousin who did live in domestic work invited her to come stay in her small flat. But Barbara wanted more privacy, so after 3 weeks, she moved into her own place. Her experiences as a cashier in the segregated convenience and clothing stores in Jacksonville gave her the good fortune of not having to choose domestic work for income. And she says her timing was right, and the literature tells us that by the late 1960s, Black women were beginning to access entry-level sales jobs in Manhattan's significant retail industry. And so she applied for work in stores where she observed Black shoppers. And she found something right away on 34th Street near 7th Avenue. Now, I'm not sure if it was the R.H. Macy and Company store, but Barbara is here tonight, so we can ask her. Raise your hand, Barbara. So Barbara moved to New York to escape several situations that she felt had become untenable, living so close to her family in the Deep South. When she was about 19, her mother had forced her to marry Richard, who was a nice boy who lived in a nice family next door. But having witnessed abuse from her father towards her mother, she was reluctant to marry at all. She engaged in some rebellious activity to protest, but eventually she did marry Richard. Their marriage lasted 5 years. He was drafted, sent overseas to Vietnam, but when he was present, she found him controlling and possessive in ways that made her long to escape their union. While Barbara Jean was still living in Florida, a woman who had grown up in her hometown had gone off to New York and would return from time to time. When she walked down the street, people would peek from behind their curtains and whisper, "Bulldagger." Hearing her family speak about this person with such contempt helped Barbara Jean understand that this was a woman who, quote, goes with women. And she told me, quote, "That's like a no-no. That's like a horror. That's a God is going to curse you and send you to hell." Yet the woman possessed a certain openness and ability to walk freely that was attractive and revealed a confidence that Barbara Jean wanted for herself. One day, while sitting on her steps, the two struck up a conversation, and Barbara Jean found herself in a kiss. After a moment, she pulled back. After a moment, she pulled back, fiercely asked the woman to leave, but later that afternoon, she went over to apologize for her strong reaction. And the experience confirmed her own suspicion. Shortly afterwards, she became sure about where her head was and whether she liked men or women, and she decided that she did indeed desire women. Now, reflecting on that experience, she soon figured out that she did not want to be with the type of woman that she had her first romantic experience with, because being raised as a, quote, Southern style, go-to-church community type person, that caused her to view this woman, who was called a bulldagger, as a street person. But she was curious. She now spent hours thinking every day about what type of woman she could see herself with. So when her cousin offered the opportunity to come north, she decided to take a chance and learn what kind of woman might be a good fit for her. Offer you one more story. Cassandra Grant. Sometime in the 1930s, Aunt Bee and Uncle Clarence sponsored Cassandra Grant's family in their migration from Georgetown, South Carolina to New York City. Her father was part of the more than 1 million GI Negroes who fought in World War II. So he left for Italy while her mother and oldest brother stayed with Bee and Clarence. After the war ended, the family moved to Harlem. And at that time, units in the Lincoln Housing Project were available to veterans, and Cassandra was born there in 1947, the middle of 3 children and the only girl. Now, Cassandra feels strongly about the fact that at that time, African American soldiers were denied access to veteran loans and unable to purchase houses in the suburbs. But she also recalls that the Lincoln houses were, quote, really a wonderful place to live. Built right after World War II, 1,200 units in 14 high-rise buildings from East 132nd Street to East 135th, from Fifth Avenue to East River Drive, now we know it as FDR Drive. Some of the buildings were 15 stories high, so she had tons of friends, she says. And these families tended to also have migrated from places in South Carolina, so they were pretty close-knit, with fish fries and funerals, house parties and waistline parties, and christenings in churches throughout Harlem that brought the neighbors together. Her household usually had 2 earners, so the family income was too high to qualify for public assistance, but job security was hard to come by, so one of her parents was always looking for work. But despite this economic precarity, her mother always provided extra, making sure they read books they could borrow from one of the public libraries in Harlem. And they also participated in sports clubs and dance classes at the historic Harlem YMCA. She attended Florida A&M, and she majored in early childhood education. While in college, she says she experienced men whose company she enjoyed, as well as a woman that she fell in love with. And it wasn't until she was engaged to marry a man and began planning a permanently heterosexual life that she thought seriously about a different path for her future. Something inside told her, quote, I don't know if you're making the right decision. He's a nice guy, and you'd probably have a great family, but maybe that might not be right for you. Soon after, she met Lavinia Pinson, and she says that was it. It was on. It was an opportunity to be crystal clear about my sexuality. So then she says, so they ended up going on to work with other women to build Salsa Soul, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But she says if she hadn't met Lavinia, things could have gone a different way. And so she muses, I think that if I probably didn't have that experience, I might have gotten married to a man and maybe stayed in it for a while and then got out of the marriage, because I think eventually I would have probably found myself leaning towards where I should be. But the thing is, with the right experience, you kind of get it right. So there are so many lessons in those stories and in all of the women's stories. And some of the recovery work that I do in this project is to relate the experiences of these Black lesbian women to other populations of sexual minorities migrating to large cities, and of course to other populations of Black migrants. For African American women, the understanding of same-sex desire was an ongoing, continuous process of searching and development rather than a singular coming out or a movement from heterosexual to lesbian identity. This framework had to be negotiated and renegotiated. So the second Great Migration touched almost every woman's experience in my work. through their own geographic mobility or through the culture's and sense of community created by the adults who had previously relocated. I studied 3 groups of women: migrants, the children of migrants, and those who were born and raised in cities who were there to receive the migrating women and to participate with them in various work and social worlds. Their movements were constrained, of course, by racism, by sexism, by structural inequalities in labor markets and in housing. And these conditions aided, delayed, or hindered their ability to be self-sufficient. But they had to be self-sufficient because without economic independence, there was little chance of being able to sustain themselves in ways that offered a freedom to choose a life of loving other women. So we can't tell a story about Black women's identity and community, about the autonomy that's needed to entertain their own same-sex desire without looking at these factors: sexual minority women as actors in the Black migration, helping to transform existing ways of life and create new ways of living. Women's dominance in the Black church is relevant, and I have a chapter on this. Those experiences influenced the culture and structure of the sexual communities they developed. Formal, informal, and underground labor markets are really important to study, right, to see how they found work. And then the influence of existing social movements on how they would come to expand their understandings of their own identities and group membership. Now, in the first stage of this research, I gathered ethnographic field notes, oral histories, focus group interviews with Black women and men who self-identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, in the life, or same-gender loving. They were born in 1955 or earlier, and they were living in Los Angeles or New York. The average age of the study participants was 65, and they ranged in age from 54 to 81. But as I began to work with my own case studies, I realized that there were silences in the data. There were things that I just didn't, they wouldn't tell me, or they didn't experience. There were things that were missing. And so I needed other sources. So I combed through archives across the country, looking for interviews in different collections. And I found interviews, letters, personal memorabilia, news stories in Black magazines and newspapers, meeting minutes from feminist organizations with women of color. And these are some of where I got my cases from. And here are the archival collections that I drew from. Now, dating back as early, at least as early as the 20s, and I'm certain earlier, we know that Black sexual minority women created private social spaces with other Black gay women and men, inviting those that they did not know to join them. So I offer you Mabel Hampton. She recalls that as a young woman in the 20s, she lived in Lower Manhattan, and she attended parties that her neighbor used to host. And she said these were pay parties, which she distinguished from rent parties. And they were all colored women, she says. And here is a flyer. You know, we give out flyers for parties, and I don't know if they do it anymore, but this is from 1932, and you see her nice little card that she was giving out. So this is with her partner, Lillian Foster. And here are Mabel and Lillian through the decades. So Mabel and Lillian continued in this type of socializing across different boroughs and New Jersey well into the 60s. We also have Ruth Ellis, who reports that from 1941 through the 1960s, she and her partner, Cecilene Franklin, opened their home in Detroit as a social space, and she says it became known as the Gay Spot. And these images are from the parties she used to throw in Detroit, and I love these photos because it captures the era of the 1950s. So the activities that Black lesbians hosted were part of a long history of African Americans creating covert secular institutions of social interaction in spaces that were shielded from public view. They hosted parties in someone's apartment, at a hole in the wall, temporary space that they might have rented out, as well as beach outings and large picnics in the park. And this allowed them to flirt and dance and have a physical as well as psychic space that connected same-sex desire with African American culture. And that offered autonomy for from black heterosexuals as well as white lesbians. And so here's a picture of a lesbian house party from the GLBT Historical Society collection. And you can't see there's a carton that says, the milk carton that says homo milk. Now this is, I think it's homogenized, it means homogenized milk for the 1960s, but clearly somebody thought, I don't think they were drinking milk at this party, so I think that they brought this there as a connection to what they were doing. And these parties were racially segregated and class integrated, with women from diverse ways of life participating. So I want to offer you an excerpt from my own field notes of a party that I attended hosted by these now older women. So women who were young in this age and now are a little older. So I say, from the time I arrived at the women's tea dance that afternoon, I thought I had stepped into a scene that was a mixture of a Sunday church dinner and an evening at Ruth Ellis's gay spot in 1960s Detroit, and a party that Audre Lorde once described in her memoir. The Harlem brownstone was owned by a woman in her 70s who rented it out for special events while she lived in a second brownstone next door. And throughout the night, you could see her peeking over, keeping an eye on things and watching as the guests stepped outside to smoke or talk. This was 2003, and I was heavily in the field researching what would eventually become Invisible Families. But the crowd was older than what I had been seeing at other events. But the sight of these 60-something-year-old women carrying food from their cars up those long flights of stairs to the kitchen seemed familiar, though in a church group context. And I wrote in my notes that the food was delicious. They had blackened catfish, fried porgies, fried chicken, West Indian curry chicken, macaroni and cheese, potato salad, collard greens, peas and rice, green salad, homemade dressings, 2 kinds of scratch cake, and sweet potato pie. And a plate, you could get a plate with 2 meats, 2 vegetables, and 2 starches for $7. For $3 more, you could get a slice of pie or cake. And my mother, who was in charge of the kitchen at the storefront Holiness Church that I grew up attending, would have related well to these lesbian women despite her disapproval of such a lifestyle. The guests could not purchase liquor directly, but they could buy a chip in exchange for a drink. So a green chip for beer was $3, a $4 red chip would get you a glass of wine, and the $5 gold chip was for top shelf liquor or champagne. And so the sale of the chips for the drinks is what allows them to bypass the laws restricting the sale of alcohol, and they could earn an extra $1,000 by the night's end. Down on the main floor, the largest room was reserved for dancing, while the second room towards the back of the house held tables with vendors selling items like handmade jewelry, t-shirts with Afrocentric and lesbian themes, and sex toys. So, while the literature on the development of community among white women, in that literature, the bar is identified as having distinct cultures and mores. But I argue that in Black lesbian spaces, the culture is located in the women, in their racial identities, and everything that comes with it, in their geographies, in their institutions, in their family experiences, and they bring the culture with them to the social spaces they create. It's recognizable to racial insiders, and it signals a belonging. And even if they've migrated from a different state, the racial signifying of the party lets them know that the space is for them. And this is important for the sexual politics that they come to develop in the 70s, because they are able to behave as lesbians when the social environment is culturally familiar. So this brownstone party that I described in my field notes celebrated many aspects of Black culture. If you think about the importance of having the food, that's why I spent so much time identifying what they had, the entrepreneurs selling goods that appealed to Black women. The playlist of the music was important, right? It wasn't just background noise, the styles of dress. And these house parties have an important historical connection to rent parties during the Harlem Renaissance, to the Jim Crow era juke joints in the backwoods of the rural South, and also catching the spirit at church revivals. And I never got to fully analyze the role of parties in my first monograph. I was really focused on family building and identity construction among modern day women, but it stayed with me. I also found that across the different cities, African American lesbians had closer relationships with Black gay men and tended to socialize with them more consistently than what has been reported among white women and men. For example, Deborah, who lived in Southern California with her spouse, Lenora, they shared with me photo albums of past parties, and men were almost always present. And for those familiar with the Boots of Leather collection at the Lesbian History Archives, Anne was a person hosting house parties and picnics for women in the 50s and 60s, and I believe this is a photo of Anne wearing a checkered dress in the image on the right. Sometimes she organized these events and shared the cooking with gay men. And in Mark Stein's Philadelphia archive, Mox Nix was a social group founded in the 60s for, quote, gay girls and gay fellas who were African American. So by actively creating and nurturing solidarity around this purposeful intersection of race and sexuality, they helped solidify a Black gay identity as a social orientation. But for women, it wouldn't develop into a political identity until much later, in the 70s and into the 80s. And this would be primarily for the college-educated, still purposefully mixed with Black culture and artistic expression. Someone in Detroit, she surmises that there was a tight underground network that worked. She says there was a sense of community, but there was no clearly defined community. Because they needed a scaffold to take hold, to move beyond an individual's, just an individual's interests. They needed institutional help from different communities where women have power and independence. And the scaffold was the mixing of Black culture into the social and political activities that drew these women together. So this was now the 70s, and if there was going to be fraternizing between women, the space had to be recognizable as Black. A very small group of Black lesbians had the social and economic resources to take care of themselves, and this gave them the freedom to think deeply about how their experiences as Black women related to their same-sex desire. They wanted to build on the cultural and artistic interests, and there's some really great stories they tell about the clothing and the drumming and the people who were having babies. But they had to learn how to navigate family dynamics. But most other Black lesbian women were struggling. They were poor. In the urban landscape of the 60s and 70s, Black unemployment rates were high. Black queer folks struggled. They struggled with histories of childhood trauma, with alcohol and drug addictions, with experiences of being homeless. They were in need of supports in multiple areas of their lives. So there were many who had great needs. They were committed to maintaining a relationship to the racial community, even though it did not accept lesbian sexuality as a way to live openly. It was not accepted as a way to live openly. And Cassandra, she does a great job describing the liminal space that she and others were occupying at the same time. She says, there were a lot of things going on in your life, hanging out with your college friends and kind of distancing yourself from them, because now you're carving out a new way of being in the world. Not being too close to your family, because your family's not really on the road with you, and you don't want to bust their bubble. You just want to keep them happy. So you've got to find a new place to be. You got to find a new groove, because all the old grooves aren't working. The college folks not working, the liberation group is not working, because they don't want to hear nothing about being gay. They want to hear what you're doing to make the movement happen. And then you're here with all these white women, and they're not dancing the way you're dancing. They're not talking the way you're talking, and you're saying, well, I don't think I belong here. And they're not making you feel real. They're not making you feel yourself, and you don't quite know how to articulate it. You think I'm here, but I really don't belong here. So there were women like Cassandra pursuing fulfilling careers, even with the discrimination that was going on. They were thinking and writing about the political aspects of having a lesbian visibility, and also the costs of that in the racial community. Other women engaging in same-sex relationships were struggling in poor quality lesbian relationships, as well as unhappy heterosexual marriages that they felt required to stay in because they had children. They had a sense of shame around their same-sex desires. And they were looking, consciously or not, they were just really looking for a way to understand themselves and to reduce self-loathing. They were developing networks, right? They found out about something that might be happening, and these networks were different groups of lesbians. So you had the educated and politically active, you had the working class activists, you had the hustlers, you had those who were in and out of jail. But they weren't creating a lasting sense of community. Before Stonewall and other activities like that happening around the country, they could relay information to one another, but not community. Thelma says, quote, "We had special places that we met and partied, but immediately after that, it was back to the closet." So they begun by the end of the 1960s. They'd begun to connect with working class grassroots lesbians. Their activism was not in their sexuality. The activism was organizing food programs for their communities, working on juvenile rights issues, substance abuse programs that were specific for women because women had children and they had special needs when they were struggling with addictions. They were also helping bring awareness to the characteristics of rape and family violence in their own racial and ethnic communities. But in this context of this activist work, they also began to vocalize their same-sex desires as identities that could coexist with other structural locations. The Black Lesbian Caucus, this is the Black Lesbian Caucus, a precursor to Salsa Soul. Because their identities had already been established in race, they had to figure out how to build on that sense of self. And in acts of resistance, they began to construct alternatives. They drew from the Black freedom movements and the Black art movements. You can very clearly see the influence on the politics that they created. We see the purposeful centering of African American artistic expression with their poetry, readings and their plays and their music. Dr. Wilhelmina Perry says that race was central to discussions with lesbian feminists. She says, so that's the discussion that was sometimes had with white women when they didn't understand that our reference groups weren't necessarily lesbian, that we're Black or we're Christian or we're this or that. And many of them are hard-nosed on the first identity is lesbian. And we keep saying, no, the first identity is not lesbian. It's that I'm a Black woman, you see, and that doesn't ring for them. So that's how she felt at the time. She's not here tonight, or we could ask her how she feels now. She said they feel that that's total compromise, and you really have to say sorry. It may be different in your world, but this is the way it is in my world. So I capture these processes in several ways. One of them is the analysis and the founding of Salsa Soul Sisters, an organization dedicated to the social and political exploration of lesbian sexuality in the context of race. And the goal there is to provide support, companionship, and imagination of what could be, of a life that was chosen, a life that you could choose. They met weekly with rap sessions, they had guest speakers, trips to P-Town, and to Reese Beach, all to nurture women of color, helping themselves to understand themselves and to reduce the shame that went along with same-sex desire during that period. They would go to Bonnie and Clyde's, a party in the village where many Black women experienced racial discrimination, and leave flyers. Asabi Davis recalls how she found out about it. She says, quote, I hooked up with Salsa, I guess in 1977, the first year after they got together. I was pulled out of Bonnie and Clyde by Jean Wimberly, Jean who's also in this work, who has gone on. And she says, quote, you do not want to be in this bar. You need to come around the corner with us. Other people talking about the group would say, you know, there are going to be some fine sisters there. I'm telling you, there are some fine women at that meeting, and when you get there, you're gonna go, oh gosh, it's heaven. I mean, there were some people interested in politics, right? There's some people when you read the archives and they say it was all about the politics, and the other one would say, oh no, there was not in politics. So one last point I want to make about the path to community for Black lesbian women in the 70s is that the understanding of intersectionality as an intra-categorical racial framing, intra-categorical within the group. So the development of Salsa Soul reveals that there were many points of commonality shared across the Black women and Latina women and some Asian American women as well. Racism was the common entry point into the formation of women of color groups. There were also, though, divergent perspectives and unequal experiences producing intra-group conflict. There were differences around education, skin color, income, work history, and these led to conflicts over what would be the best path to their collective liberation. In Salsa Soul, for example, there were 3 areas where there was not consensus. There were more, but these 3 I think are interesting. One is whether and how to discuss domestic violence in lesbian relationships. Working versus middle class ideas about masculine gender presentation expressed through men's clothing, as opposed to the ambiguity of gender neutral clothing found in African dashikis, let's say. And 3, whether and how to include white women lovers and white presenting Latina lesbians in the consciousness raising programming in private spaces that were dedicated specifically to women of color. So to conclude, I will say that more than 30 years ago, anthropologist Denise Lockhart determined that the important features of something that could be labeled lesbian community included the social ties amongst and within the group, a shared group identity, a common agreement of the values of the subculture, and the existence of spaces where community members could interact. And I have found that before Black sexual minority women saw themselves as a group organized around same-sex desire, they were a group organized around racial identity with the ideals represented in Lockhart's research. So they saw themselves as being connected already through race and gender. And then even if they didn't, society maintained strong boundaries around this, defining them this way. Now, sociologists who write about the development of sexual communities, they spend a lot of time talking about bars and gay neighborhoods, using these as markers of change. But these have been far more relevant to certain populations than others. And I question the universality of that model. I examine the spaces where same-sex attractions among Black women take root. So these are women-dominated spaces. Bars, yes, but also institutions like the church, all-girls high schools, houses of prostitution, all of these existing in racially segregated neighborhoods. The informal economy also emerges as an underexplored site of autonomy for Black lesbians. And we have a chapter about this, about the kinds of work that the women did. So the very last thing I will share is that in the 1982 seminal work, All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave, Gloria Hull and Barbara Smith told us that the part of the process of existing is the ability to name oneself. And for Black women, this is to be accomplished through work that defines and analyzes their experiences, not in relation to other groups, but within and amongst themselves. So Black lesbians, even those who grew up with very little economic struggle, have their origins in other political and personal struggles to exist and survive using whatever tools they could find. And it's the mixing of these experiences that form the foundation for what would eventually become a Black lesbian consciousness and community. Thank you for staying awake and for your
Thank you, Dr. Moore, for the beautiful photographs, I'm sure that we all have lots of questions and comments. I want to know what is Macy's also. I have lots of other questions, but we're going to take a moment, and some of you go back to the buffet as we gather our questions and comments, and we'll begin a question with Dr. Moore. You that quote about naming, and I wonder whether you can speak to different naming things. And one is, you may end your Salsa Soul Sisters to a Lusk. The other thing is lesbian in your presentation study.
Start with the first. So I am using a lot of language in this presentation. Self-expression for the women that I study, not just the women at the time that I'm talking to them when they're older, but in previous generations when they're sharing with me how they experienced their lives coming of age, or when I'm looking at archival material when they are actually younger and sometimes talking about their experiences while they're living them. So this language changes. You can imagine it changes through the generations. And I think even as the world changes, their language changes. So in Invisible Families, I really rarely use lesbian. I use gay women, or I talk about the way women loving women, and I talk about the different ways that women that I spoke to and in the community use those terms. I don't think there's one way, but I do think that part of being okay with some of the other language is experienced as the world changes. So the world changes a great deal through their adult lives, and that impacts a lot of their thinking. And you can see as they're talking, the shifts in how they're thinking about themselves and the use of how comfortable they are with those words, with those defining terms. So I'm more careful about it in my writing. In terms of Salsa Soul, the interesting thing there is, in this chapter I talk about, I kind of ended with some of those places where they weren't in agreement, and those were quite significant and led to many changes. And so Alush is in existence when I moved back here in 2015. Alush is here when I was first doing Invisible Families. But Salsa Soul, I think last spring, Shanta Smith, she conducted 6 focus group interviews, bringing them back together. They're there to identify photos, who's in the photos, and to tell us what's happening in these photos. And they are still identifying as Salsa Soul. They're still, this is who they are. I went to an event at the New York Historical Society to celebrate Salsa Soul. I had some photos from the exhibition that was there. Salsa Soul is still in them, even though they don't meet that way anymore. And so 40 some odd years, 50 years later, it's still part of them. There's also Las Buenas Amigas, when some of the Latina lesbians break from Salsa Soul because of this issue that I shared about who are women of color when they're talking about racism. And So as is the case with many organizations like this during that time, they don't have longevity in the material sense, but the relationships that they develop are maintained, even when they stop going to the meetings or when the meetings are different now. Yeah. That was interesting to see how they still felt connected. Yes.
Okay. I wanted to thank you for that list of names on.
So many, it's so important to the story. And we are so fortunate to have the Lesbian History Archives and Shanta Smith, who's now the head librarian at Barnard. She starts this month. Yeah, she starts this month. And I want to thank Kiara Reed, who is my research assistant. She does amazing work. She's a librarian at the Schoenberg. Yeah. Columbia College, class of 24, just finished. And yeah, she's wonderful. And she's very knowledgeable about the salsa soul, as is the person next to her.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask how you imagine your work complicates work such as like Alan Berubé's Coming Out Under Fire, that posits the Conscription Act, World War II, as sort of the foundation for the queer political movement that would spin out of like the migration of queers to these like cities that they were being sent to. Yeah, I'm just interested in how you, how your work fits into that, given that I think that scholars like Berube are really focusing on white gay populations.
So Coming Out Under Fire is Berube's book that shows how World War II helps to, has an influence on the development of queer people in cities because some people are kicked out of the armed forces, and others, after they leave the armed forces, they don't go back to their homes in rural areas, and they just stay in the cities where the ports are, where they've come. And so he makes this argument for women and for men about how they talk with one another and end up locating themselves in the cities. And I think it is a good argument. There are some, right, we have racial segregation, right? So even if the black soldiers wanted to go and live in the apartment building with their comrades, they're not able to do that, right? Just racial segregation is going to prevent that. I think that there's some that are staying in the city. I think there are some black veterans who are staying in the city and living in other black neighborhoods. They come from black neighborhoods, maybe in the South, maybe in other places, maybe in other cities, but they're living in these other cities. I don't think he really tells that story, but I think it is a good story. Now, women are a little different because much of the literature on this migration of LGBT people really has some assumptions that it starts with. And so black people during that time are trying to get free, right? They're trying to get this free from this racial oppression, and the women are trying to find work. You can't, it's hard for them to get jobs. It's hard for them to have any kind of job history because they're fired very quickly. There's a lot of discrimination for black women in work. And so their timeline looks different I would say their timeline looks different, and there are other reasons for that. So they're not coming into themselves in that way in the same period. That's what I do argue.
Professor Moore, the amazing material, extraordinary work. Congratulations. Looking forward to the book. So I want to ask you about a little bit about shifts at the end of the period that you were talking about with respect to ethnicity and some of the tensions. Mm-hmm. How did you decide when to stop in terms of periodization? I mean, is it essentially that the migration generation ends? Mm-hmm. And even if that's what it is, like what else is shifting after the 79 period that, you know, like either you're not really going to get to with the project, but what are the other shifts that are happening at the end? Mm-hmm. In terms of sexual identity, in terms of practices, I mean, whatever, you know, in any, whatever way you want to tackle that question.
You know what, so I wanted to, I'm trying to be truthful here. It's not because, the truth is I wanted to stop when I felt that they were cohering as a community despite the conflicts. Because before that, I really start in the 50s. There's some stuff in the 40s, but I really start in the 50s after World War II. What happens in the 50s, what happens in the 60s, before Stonewall, then after Stonewall, and then what happens when we get into all these movements around race and gender. Once you get to the 80s, you could write a book with the 70s and 80s. I decided to stop at when they cohered as a community. That was the ending point, because I was trying to look at how they went from being individuals who didn't know if there were how many other people were like them, didn't have a sense of this as an identity, to when they created this sense of identity. Because it was just going to take too long. I just couldn't do the whole. That was really why. And then and then I wanted to be respectful of HIV and AIDS in the 80s, and I thought that was going to really need its own. And I interviewed a lot of men for this project, and so I have a sample of men, and then I have a black men, and then I have a sample of white working class lesbians, and I'm going to do something else with those data and these women.
About identities, about social identities cohering before political identities, and to talk in your materials about the social identities and making that case, and then stopping at 79 when that's all of this is thrown into controversy and political identities begin around there. I have argued it makes a lot of sense to end at that. Just at that 79 point, because one of the criticisms that I've gotten from my work that begins in 79 and ends at 95 is, so what about before 79? And I would say, well, wait until Mignon's book comes out.
Thank you for that really exceptional lecture, and I cannot wait to read the book. But I just wanted to follow up maybe on Jafari's comment about maybe the shift in the kinds of spaces that people were in, because I thought it was beautiful in the way in which you described the home as a kind of site in which people were meeting each other and socializing. And then at one point you showed people protesting in the street, and I'm wondering if that is also indicating, right, that the protest and it becomes an emergence of a political identity.
So the political identity is motivated by, I think at least two sets of actors. One group who are politically active in other ways, but not thinking about their own sexuality as something for which to have a politics. And the coming to an understanding of that through the larger LGBT activities happening in the 60s, and they come to think of, is there a way that we can do this for ourselves, for this part of ourselves? But then the other part is really, so there's a lot of politics happening. In this, there's a chapter where I really felt that I had to deal with drug use and prison time, because there were women in the 60s and 70s who had gotten caught up in drugs for different reasons. And in their time there was a women's house of detention in the village, and there was a lot of political work taking place for women who were political prisoners. And they were in there with these lesbians who were in there for looking too masculine, or for a variety of reasons. A lot of racism there, as well as some drug use sometimes. But they were learning about the politics so Assata Shakur is in this house of detention down the village, and she's there, and if you look at some of her other work, she says that she learned from the lesbians when she was in there, because this was during the time there was what was happening with the movement, right? There was this bombing, and so she was there, and there's some people who took notes about this, and there's a book about this women's house of detention. So they're learning about politics, but they happen to be lesbians. But then they begin to think, so it's in different ways. You have the college educated, you have the ones who aren't in college, who didn't finish school, but they're all starting to think about the politics, and then they begin to apply it to their lives. And so that's what I see in the 70s, and to me, to go back to that point, that's why I think that's where I wanted to stop. But there was this way of looking at all of the horrible things happening in the world, and then coming to this understanding that maybe there was some work that they could do for their own selves, for their own liberation. And so some of the women are in the they're in the different Black freedom movements, and then they talk about why they left. Right? There was just something that wasn't fulfilling there. Yeah. That's my weakest chapter, Mabel. That's the one that the editor said, we're going to take another pass at this one, so check back with me.
I'm so excited to read the book. And I have a question. You mentioned the chapter, or it could be more than one chapter, but a chapter on economic freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, give us a teaser about what you explore as you're looking more deeply at economic freedom.
Yeah. So I have a paper that's under review that looks at women's labor market experiences and the necessity of being able to provide for yourself in order to have a possibility of living in a life that includes you having same-sex desire and acting on it. And in that chapter, I show work on that chapter. It's co-authored with my former graduate student, Estella Diaz, who's now a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton. And we show how the informal labor market becomes a site not just for ways to help make ends meet. So there are people who are, it's hard to keep a job in the formal labor market, so they're doing all kinds of things. They're taxi drivers, they're photographers who are taking pictures outside the Apollo, who then get to work with other photographers. They're selling dinners. They're doing a lot of other things. And then there are some who are they do sex work, different kinds of sex work. They're pimps. They sell sex for money. They provide a space for women, a safe space for women who You know, maybe there are these truckers who want to have a nice night, and so they connect women to these clients. And so there are all kinds of ways that the informal labor market is used to supplement while they're going in and out of formal labor markets. In that chapter, we talk about that. For the middle class women, and I don't like to use that because maybe you know, college educated, but not even that. There are women who find good jobs. They're able to, depending on the conditions of the city, of Detroit or New York during the time that they come of age. Some of them are able to, in the 70s, get a job at the post office or go back to school, and that really helps them. In the 60s in Detroit, some of them are able to get federal jobs. That helps them. Some are teachers and nurses, and they're gym teachers and stuff. And so they're having another experience too. Still racism, you know, hard to keep those jobs. But those jobs allow them to have an opportunity to do something else. Not many are domestic workers, though. That's interesting too. Even in the 40s and 50s, where a lot of black women they're not doing that. You gonna tell us?
I sit here and I look at you and I'm listening to you as I eat. You are so amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Okay,
All right.
I'll start over.
Oh no.
You are amazing. You have been very interesting, extremely thorough as you presented yourself about us that are here looking and loving you. So just thank you for all of your wisdom and knowledge and your ability to be inclined to move forward and deeper as you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We couldn't have a better coda, right? And there's nothing better for a scholar who is grounded in her community to hear that.
Yes, right.
And
That's
so
right. Thank you so much.
thank you. So a warm round of applause for Dr. Moore.
Thank you. All right.
Our colleague Sharon Harris and Tanya Pugh have made sure that we have speaking of covered plates at parties, pretend you're at a lesbian party in 1955 and get you a covered plate, please. A church plate, amen?
That's right. All right, thank you.